Welcome back, Your Excellency Ambassador Holmes, Your Excellency Mr. Yasser Yakesh, distinguished guests, honorable young leaders, fellow participants. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you back to the second day of the Ankara Conference on Peacebuilding and Conflict Resolution, where we're really trying to see what role does cultural diplomacy have, or what role can cultural diplomacy have in helping to educate, enhance, and sustain relationships, both within nations, regions, as well as the global perspective. I think yesterday we had the chance to explore many of the challenges facing peacekeeping and peacebuilding, as well as many of the opportunities. And I must say I was very pleased to see the level of optimism that I think on the whole the speakers yesterday really did see a potential for culture. They did see a potential for more engagement. Today I'm hoping we can also discuss more this issue also of leadership. What does it really mean to lead? What responsibility do we have also as citizens, and do we have as civil society? Is it enough to just point fingers at global governance? In the UN we were pointing some fingers yesterday, or is it enough to point fingers at the politicians? But actually, what responsibility do we have? After all, we're the ones who are voting for these politicians. We're the ones who are creating these governmental structures. And beyond that, what role in our civil capacity is maybe there? In the sense, should we not just be concerned with our prophet, our family, our group, our tribe? Should we also be concerned with our neighbor? And if so, how should we be concerned? Should there be a level of volunteerism? Should there be a level of engagement outside even of our professional capacity? So I think there I'd love to also reflect a little bit in the context of the discussions today on that great potential that I think is there, largely untapped in most of the cultures that we've been discussing in terms of really the civic responsibility that remains. One country that I think has served as a model in that regard, in terms of really civic engagement as well as cultural diplomacy engagement, is actually Canada. So I'm very happy that we can begin the second day focusing on Canada. I was talking to Ambassador Holmes earlier this morning and reflecting to him how grateful the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is to Canada as actually being one of our first major governmental partners and also first major governmental sponsors. We started back in 2002 the Canada Meets Germany, a Forum for Young Leaders program, very much thanks to the vision and also the leadership of Ambassador Marie-Bernard Meunier, who is the former ambassador of Canada to Germany. She and then Karsten Vogt, who was at the time the coordinator for the Americas for the German Foreign Ministry, really pioneered this program with ICD. And what was interesting, not many people know this, but the German Marshall Plan was not just American money. 17% of that actually came from Canada. And our program was actually the first program funded by the German European Recovery Program in honor of the Marshall Plan dealing with Canada. So in that sense, we were really trying to also remember the contributions that even back in the Marshall Plan, Canada made that very often go unnoticed. So in many ways, I think Canada really has served as a leader in many ways in terms of where really culture and cultural diplomacy can come in, the importance of education, and of course, in the importance of peacekeeping. So in that sense, I'm really happy we can begin with Canada this morning. I'd like to say a few words of introduction about His Excellency, Ambassador John T. Holmes, who is currently the Ambassador of Canada to Turkey as of the beginning of this year. Ambassador Holmes initially completed his BA in 1978 and then LLB studies in 1982 at McGill University in Canada. He joined the Department of External Affairs in 1982. Since then, he has served abroad in Bridgetown, Barbados, Accra, Ghana, and New York at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations, working in particular on the Convention on the Rights of Children. Back in Ottawa, he held a number of important positions, including Director General of the Middle East Bureau and Director of the United Nations Human Rights and Economic Law Division. He was also the coordinator for the key part of the Rome Statute on International Criminal Court, ICC. Between 2003 and 2011, he served as the ambassador in Jordan, Indonesia, and became the first Canadian ambassador to the ASEAN. Since December 2011, he has served as the ambassador of the Republic of Canada to the Republic of Turkey, with concurrent accreditation in the Republic of Azerbaijan, the Republic of Georgia, and Turkmenistan. The topic that His Excellency Ambassador Holmes has chosen for this morning is conflict prevention and international justice, a Canadian perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for His Excellency Ambassador John Holmes. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you very much, Mark, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out this morning. and listening to me. But more importantly, what I want to do is just flag a few issues from a Canadian perspective, and then hopefully provoke a bit of a dialogue and discussion on some of the issues that I wanted to raise this morning. I think it was, I'll get this wrong slightly, but I think the New York Times once did a survey of the most boring headline ever, and I think the survey or the poll came up with Canada launches new initiative. So we sometimes, if you look at the headlines of our newspapers, Globe and Mail from Toronto or the Vancouver Sun, sometimes what preoccupies us to the rest of the world looks like a lot of minutia. They are important issues in Canada: healthcare, the budget, balancing the budget to eliminate the temporary deficit that we have. But when you've got war and conflict going on in different parts of the world, Canada is maybe a nice place, if a boring place. So my aim today is talk a little bit about these issues: peace building, conflict resolution, justice, and try not to be too boring, even if I am Canadian. I've looked at the program, and it's a very wide scope, which makes for very interesting discussions and panels and presentations. And I'm sorry I missed yesterday's event. I'll try to stay today as long as I can, because the topics are both very relevant to what's going on in the world and I think intellectually stimulating. What I wanted to focus on was two themes or sub-themes of the conference's broad mandate, and that is conflict prevention. We tend to use more the concept of conflict management now, but it's prevention and dealing with the conflict. And second of all, international justice. And obviously I'll focus on some of the things that Canada is doing in these areas. Many of today's most pressing security concerns are the results of civil wars or civil unrest within states or within broader regions. And these are often compounded by state fragility. Now, we define that as a state's incapacity or lack of will to maintain the rule of law and provide core services to its populations. States with fragility affect roughly 15% of all states, and a population close to 1 billion people are affected by state fragility. Obviously, that many people affected, the human impact can be terrible. Fragile states often act as conduits for transnational organized crime, piracy, terrorism, arms proliferation, and the violent targeting of vulnerable populations. This type of insecurity cost the international system $270 billion. That's one estimate. Our government responds through a variety of tools and mechanisms. Obviously, diplomatic engagement is vital, including through preventive diplomacy and mediation efforts. Second of all, we use targeted economic sanctions, including export controls, in situations such as Syria, such as Iran, where the governments are reluctant to comply with international obligations. We also use the deployment of civilian and at times military experts in areas such as elections monitoring, legal and constitutional reform, policing, border management, corrections, training of foreign military forces, protection of particularly vulnerable populations, including women and girls. And finally, we provide financial and expert support to international peacekeeping operations. In my view, it is self-evident that the risk of conflicts becoming violent is greatest in fragile states and in situations where there is a history of violence. Indeed, the 2011 World Development Report notes that more than 90% of civil wars in the 2000s occurred in countries that had already experienced a civil war in the preceding 30 years. Fragile states are characterized by poverty, particularly high youth unemployment, poor governance, the lack of basic services through weak or illegitimate state institutions, especially in areas of law and justice, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. There are also pressing inequalities among social, ethnic, regional, and religious groups, as well as the infiltration of criminal or terrorist networks. Such fragile states are generally ill-equipped to handle sudden internal or external shocks, like currency collapses, natural disasters, or political crises. And these shocks are often the trigger leading to violent outbreaks within the country and often spreading to the region. The international community has extensive experience with varied success, we must admit, in conflict prevention or conflict management. The United Nations obviously plays a leadership role, but more recently regional organizations such as the African Union, the Arab League, the Organization of American States, World Bank, the OECD, are all contributing to developing principles and guidelines based on their previous experiences and lessons learned. And I want to also highlight the important role of civil society organizations, including NGOs, think tanks, foundations, academic institutions. All of them are key players internationally in conflict management. Mentioning the OECD, in 2007 it adopted principles for good international engagement in fragile states and situations. This document highlights 10 principles which, at first glance, appear obvious, but which are often neglected in conflict situations. I want to highlight just two of these very briefly, and that first is taking context as a starting point, and second of all, doing no harm. On the first point, no two conflicts are the same. While lessons learned from other situations can and should guide the international community, sound political analysis is needed to design the international response that is appropriate and helpful to the country and the regional context. I'm sure there'll be questions later on in terms of what's going on in the world. If we take the example of Libya, there was one international response. Some would argue similar circumstances going on now in Syria, different international response thus far. The principles, the second point is do no harm. And this, again, sounds very self-evident, but it's often very critical. And there have been, and I won't get into too much examples, but there have been many international interventions in the past which inadvertently created social divisions and worsened the situation, even though the objective of going in and providing assistance was done in good faith with the best intentions. And often this comes from a rapid response without the necessary sound analysis to understand the fissures affecting this particular fragile state and how best to function in this particular environment. The principles and other related documents highlight the importance of addressing the root causes of violence, which of course will vary with each context, as well as the importance of the international community acting in a coordinated and sustained manner. Again, if you look back, many examples over the past few decades where the international community intervened, did a lot of very good work, and then picked up, moved out, and had to come back in a few years later. I think one classic example is Haiti. I think the current international intervention, to my knowledge, I joined Foreign Affairs in 1982. This is at least the third, if not the fourth, major international intervention in Haiti. Rarely are conflicts unidimensional, and rarely can they be solved through a limited form of engagement. So hence the importance of a sustained approach. Now, I want to talk about a couple of aspects of the broader notion of conflict prevention or management, and that is mediation and peacekeeping. Mediation, increasingly important. It's generally defined as a mode of negotiation in which a third party helps two or more sides find a solution which they cannot find on their own. Mediation skills can be employed before there is an outbreak of violence, during ongoing hostilities to try to bring a truce or an end to hostilities, or in order to finally consolidate peace and lay the foundation for sustainable development. With an audience like this, I'm sure you're aware of many successful mediation efforts. Going back to the 70s, the American role in fostering peace between Israel and Egypt, Norway's role in the Oslo Peace Accord. But there's also been a number of non-state mediation efforts which have been very successful. Mark mentioned I was ambassador in Indonesia. There, an NGO led by the former Finnish president Martti Ahtisaari led an effort which led to peace in the province of Aceh. And of course, the United Nations, led by the Secretary General, plays a very important role. Under the UN Charter, the Secretary General has powers to use his good offices to mediate, fact-finding, and to try to bring an early solution to conflict situations. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, took advantage of this during his tenure and now has been appointed jointly by the UN Secretary General and the Arab League to try to mediate in Syria. Choosing the mediator, the right mediator, is of course always the challenge. Obviously, the UN is often the default mode. It is universally, it has universal membership, Secretary General, excellent reputation. So, and the role of the UN Security Council as the primary, having the primary responsibility for international peace and security. Obviously, the UN is thought of first and foremost, but it may not always be the best case. So there are a number of situations where regional organizations, for example, NGOs would be best suited to take on the job. But what is important is to have a vision of how to provide support to the process. And always striving to avoid a situation which unfortunately does emerge every once in a while where there's competition between mediators. So you have the UN, regional organization, NGOs, different states coming to the fore, all trying to mediate and sometimes complicating this situation. Mediators must be able to demonstrate such capacities as the ability and readiness to mobilize resources, staying power, I mentioned before the importance of sustainability, as well as competency, both in diplomacy and in the technical issues that are being discussed. Mediation's taking on a prominent role this year in the UN. Qatar, which has been very active in different mediation efforts itself. The Qatari president of the General Assembly has proposed the theme of, quote, mediation in the settlement of disputes by peaceful means for this year's high-level debate at the UN General Assembly. This follows the unanimous adoption in June of last year of a resolution which calls on the UN to continue strengthening the ability to lead mediation and encourage states to develop national mediation capacities. We recognize, Canada, the need to improve the effectiveness of international mediation activities, and we welcome the initiative by Qatar. We have provided $24 million since 2006 to the UN, to the African Union, to the Organization of American States, to prevent and resolve conflicts in places such as the Sudans, Colombia, Central America, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have a special task force, Canada's Stabilization and Reconstruction Task Force. It's called START, which is active in providing policy advice to international players and in providing targeted and results-based programming in key areas. One of the most high profile is the work that we're doing, formerly called the Dubai process. It's now called the Afghanistan-Pakistan cooperation process. This is a mechanism where our diplomats facilitate discussions between all the players on border management issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've been involved in that since 2007. We've also supported the Doha peace process. This is funded jointly by the African Union and the UN, trying to deal with the situation in Darfur. We've also been active with the Sudan North-South Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which is not much of a peace agreement these days if you look at the news. But we were active in the lead up to the independence of South Sudan, particularly the organization of the referendum, which led to the Declaration of Independence. And we're also providing support to Kofi Annan's mission on Syria, which I mentioned earlier. We're also working to build the mediation capacity of international actors. We're providing significant support to the startup of a UN mediation support unit. That's within the Department of Political Affairs in the UN. And as I mentioned, working with the OAS, the African Union, and other regional organizations to improve their capacities. We've helped organize an expert meeting on making international support to peace processes more effective. That was held in September last year. And we're working with a number of countries, Switzerland, Germany, the US, the OECD's network, to build on that initial meeting and develop recommendations on improving mediation interventions. Peacekeeping, of course, Canada's tradition, for those of you who don't know, and it's interesting that my second trip to Egypt, a number of Egyptian colleagues mentioned this, and the event that started UN peacekeeping was the Suez crisis of 1957. Canada's then foreign minister led an effort in the UN to develop the first comprehensive peacekeeping mission, Lester Pearson, for which he won the Nobel Prize. But the Egyptians to this day still express appreciation for that mediation and that peacekeeping role. So source of a little bit of pride for us Canadians. In fact, our foreign ministry is named, the building is named after Lester B. Pearson. We remain very active. We have 230 military, police, civilians deployed around the world. Some of our biggest missions are Haiti, the Sudans I mentioned, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're the 8th largest provider of contributions to the UN peacekeeping budget. That's over $200 million annually. And we're very active, as I mentioned, not only in money, but expert personnel for these peacekeeping efforts. Increasingly, peace building is becoming even more important than peacekeeping. As I mentioned, often if you don't build peace in a situation, the likelihood of conflict returning is greatly increased. So peace building on a long-term sustainable basis becomes increasingly important. And there's a strong reform movement going on within the UN to ensure the delivery of better, more sustained civilian expertise. The World Bank's 2011 World Development Report noted the critical importance of peace-building efforts for mitigating the negative effects of conflict on development. The UN has a special committee, C34, which has taken the initiative of addressing the transition from peacekeeping, military-driven peacekeeping operations to civilian-driven peace-building UN missions, and to define clearly the roles and responsibilities of different UN actors, complemented by others, regional organizations and NGOs. Improved coordination, funding, and delivery is a central focus of the UN's Peacebuilding Commission, which is an advisory board body to the Security Council and the General Assembly. The Commission is active currently in Burundi, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Central African Republic, Guinea, and Liberia. Different countries take the lead in coordinating and focusing on these particular situations. Canada is chairing the group on Sierra Leone. And we're proud of the fact that this particular, they call it the Sierra Leone configuration, is developing best practices that can be used in other conflict situations. So we've used it as a platform with stakeholders to focus on improved coordination and longer-term sustainable development. We also co-chair with Indonesia, also very active internationally in a number of areas, including peacekeeping, a consultative group on the UN's civilian capacity review. It has put forward a number of recommendations aimed at improving the UN's ability to build national capacity, deploy targeted civilian expertise, and draw on the capacity of member states. One of the areas that we are particularly concerned about is the importance of addressing the needs of vulnerable groups, particularly women and children. During our time on the Security Council in the late 90s, early 2000s, we sponsored a resolution, one of the first thematic resolutions at the UN, in the UN Security Council, on the protection of children in armed conflict. And we also were active in the adoption of the resolution 1325 in the year 2000 on women, peace, and security. Since that time, there have been another series of resolutions expanding on the original one, but the idea is to promote meaningful participation of women and children in peace and security activities, equality between men and women, the protection of women and girls' human rights, and their physical security, including from sexual violence in conflict situations. And finally, in the area of peace building, we've endorsed something called the New Deal on Engagement in Fragile States, which was adopted at the 4th High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness in December. It's an important step towards improving peace building and state building practice, outlining 5 peace building and state building goals for fragile states. Those include legitimate politics, improved security, improved justice, building economic foundations, and improved revenue management and service. Now, I just want to talk briefly and then open it up for comments, criticisms, questions, just on the area of justice. Now, as Mark mentioned, much of my career in Ottawa and in New York was in the area of international law. And one of the most important files that I worked on was the establishment of the International Criminal Court and working on other international justice bodies. A key aspect, I believe, for sustainable conflict prevention and peace building is the need for the rule of law, including justice reform and transitional justice processes. In his seminal 2004 report on the rule of law and transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict societies, the UN Secretary General noted that justice, quote, justice, peace, and democracy are not mutually exclusive objectives, but rather mutually reinforcing imperatives. Over the last 20 years, the work of the UN and other international bodies as well as states, such as Canada, have focused on a number of justice-related issues, such as capacity building, training of judges, lawyers, and other practitioners, and assisting in the drafting of new legislation. That work is important to restoring, or in many cases, building the institutions and capacities necessary to ensure respect for the rule of law. Experience has shown that societies without adequate and impartial judicial institutions are most susceptible to poor governance, human rights abuses, corruption, and the victimization of the most vulnerable in society. In countries emerging from conflict, violent conflict, a critical but challenging aspect of strengthening the rule of law is the issue of bringing to account those responsible for serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law. Transitional justice can have a significant impact on peace building. As noted in the World Development Report, transitional justice processes are key elements for national reconciliation and restoring trust between citizens and state institutions, both necessary for long-term peace and stability. In the SecGen's report, 2004, criminal trials can play an important role in transitional justice contexts. In addition to providing direct individual accountability, they can also help societies establish detailed records of what happened, which is a valuable function in the healing process, as well as serving to delegitimize, that was a terrible Freudian slip, delegitimize extremist elements. The 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, reaffirms the primary responsibility of states to combat impunity and prosecute those responsible for serious crimes. It also provides a mechanism for the prosecution of those crimes where states are unwilling or unable to prosecute domestically. That's the concept of complementarity. So primary responsibilities with the states, but where they are unwilling to prosecute, then the ICC may have jurisdiction. Domestic trials for such crimes have been very rare, however, largely because state authorities themselves are often implicated. Also, in many situations, it is often the judicial institutions which are attacked and are most vulnerable. The international community has responded not only with the creation of the ICC, but with the creation of hybrid tribunals, which are mixed international and national bodies, such as the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, as well as creating ad hoc tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. Now, these prosecutions by international tribunals, like the ICC, have brought to the fore the argument of peace versus justice. Some have argued, and did argue, that the Security Council's reference to the ICC and the ICC's indictment of Gaddafi and members of his family played a role in convincing him not to flee and thus prolong the conflict. A similar argument is now being used as to why the ICC should not be involved in the situation in Syria. Now, it's difficult to deny that international prosecutions could have an impact on negotiations aimed at ending a conflict. My own view is that the long-term risk is worse. We have decades of historical experience where the worst offenders were never brought to justice, and this has undoubtedly emboldened other coup leaders, rebel groups, and others who went on to commit terrible international crimes. So our view, Canada's view, is that we have to work together, part of a global movement with NGOs, civil society, other states, to ensure accountability for these most serious crimes. We actively support international criminal justice mechanisms. We provide assessed contributions as well as voluntary contributions to the ICC, as well as specific tribunals, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Lebanon. Of course, transitional justice in post-conflict situations is not simply about bringing perpetrators to justice. The SecGen's report mentions the importance of combining other judicial and non-judicial mechanisms, including truth commissions, vetting and reform, and reparations. These are all important to the healing process. These are complementary tools in the quest for justice and reconciliation by helping to build a historical record, restoring public trust in national institutions, and ensuring that justice focuses not only on the perpetrators, but on those who have suffered the most. And finally, Canada acknowledges that justice during and after post-conflict situations is a long-term process. It requires comprehensive, inclusive, and a flexible approach, sensitive to political, cultural, and gender aspects. Conflict management and justice are idealistic goals, frequently running into the roadblocks of reality. But if we do not try, if we do not push ahead with these ideals, we will never have a chance to build a better world. To paraphrase the philosopher Kant, every time you act morally, you have a chance to begin a bit of the world afresh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Holmes. That was an excellent presentation, and I think a perfect way for us to begin the second day of the conference. I'd also like to acknowledge, before we take a few questions, the presence of His Excellency, Ambassador Jorge Aranciba Reyes, the Ambassador of Chile to Turkey. If we could maybe give a brief welcome also to His Excellency. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. Welcome. Okay, on that note, I'd be happy to take some questions and comments. I see you've inspired a number already. We'll start in the back. As always, if you could briefly stand and also introduce yourself, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Michelle, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here this morning and for your presentation. My question relates to, I think, I'm interested in your perspective on what I see as the breakdown of conflict prevention and conflict management and implementation. I think there's broad agreement, both in individual cases and more generally speaking about conflict, over the need to address root causes and sustain attention through the, beyond a crisis period in order to ensure that, a situation makes it through. However, that often doesn't happen in reality, and it's difficult to have a discussion about what it really takes to address root causes and have sustained attention on a complex crisis. And I think Sudan's example of an extreme failure of the international community to do that. And, in addition to sort of your perspective from your work over your career on that, the issue of the contradiction between the approach to mediation and the needs to address root causes and ensure justice for crimes, because the principles of mediation, neutrality, approaching parties as equal, and so on, I think, as you can see in Sudan and many other conflicts, can come into contradiction with the need to address root causes and ensure justice. And so what does that mean for prospects for building sustainable peace in some of these protracted crises?
Thank you, and I think you've hit on the essence of the challenge for the international community. I'm less familiar with some of the situations, so I'll build on a little bit of what I do know. When I was ambassador to Indonesia, I was concurrently responsible for Timor-Leste, East Timor, and during the time there, when I first arrived, I think East Timor would be described as more or less a success. for UN intervention after a horrible period of violence in the late 90s, early 2000s. But while I was there, the UN was still present. There was an operation still going on, but there was a return to violence. And it threatened the then president of the country. He was nearly assassinated, and you had a situation where it wasn't a return of the former power that had controlled Indonesia, which had controlled East Timor. It was an internal situation, and although there were many reasons for the violence, I think some of the ones which were most relevant were economic development. The former rebel groups, the former independence fighters who felt that they had been marginalized, that they weren't getting the benefits of this new state, so they were already, they had been attuned to the use of violence to achieve their goals as freedom fighters, as independence fighters, and used it to address a situation where they felt they were being marginalized by the new elite of the country. And the second, I think, major issue was that the government of East Timor had made a conscious decision to move on. They had negotiated an agreement with Indonesia to set up a joint truth commission. It was widely criticized. The UN refused to participate, and many NGOs refused to participate in this because it was perceived as being a whitewashing of what happened with no real obligations once it was finished for the international community, Indonesia and others, to provide compensation, reparations, and to make the kind of apology that these groups wanted. I phrased it that way because Indonesia did apologize after the Commission's report came out. So it's the issue of justice, it's the issue of establishing the correct, in their minds, the correct historical record. And so you had a near breakdown of the stability and peace which had been there for a few years. I think they've gotten back on track. They just had a successful presidential election, but it demonstrates that the international community before this violence was already winding down. Many of the foreign troops and police officers were being withdrawn, and the UN was basically about to say mission accomplished, and then had to go back in. And you highlighted the situation in Sudan as well. I mean, obviously there it's very worrisome what is going on. You have two situations. You have the Darfur situation, which has become more in the background as the war between, or the conflict between the South and the North heats up. But it is still there, and the root causes have not been addressed. So it's possibly a powder keg waiting to happen again. I think your first or second point first highlights the challenge, which is we live in a world, they call it the CNN moment, and Darfur is not on the news anymore, and that doesn't mean it's solved. And unfortunately, politicians are often guided by what's on the news. So we're very focused right now on Syria. We're very focused on the North-South conflict. The DRC, Congo is very important. There have been a couple of coups in Africa. That's what we're focused on. And we have limited attention, limited resources. And so the ones that we were working on before sometimes get pushed to the side, unfortunately, and they're not solved and may come back to haunt us. So we often know what to do, but that sustained political commitment and sustained economic commitment, because it does require a vast amount of resources to rebuild a state that has gone through these kinds of traumas. So that's the challenge.
Thank you very much. Many questions. Since we're running a little late on time, let's group maybe a few questions together, if that's okay, Your Excellency, and then we can do a final brief comment, please.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I'm Alp Özer'den from the Center for Peace and Reconciliation Studies, Coventry University. My question will be on the Canadian identity as a mediator. And I was one of the evaluators of the Dubai process, so I know what a wonderful job Canada has done and has been doing in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But the issue is that with the responsibility to protect agenda, and in a way the Canada has been the engine of that process, and the way I think I would describe as a kind of a minimalist approach, more sort of on the protection aspect in terms of freedom from fear rather than freedom from want. That sort of raised level of suspicion among the countries in the South in terms of interventions and the possibility of intervention. And more importantly, I think what you said at the beginning of your talk, the reasons for fragility of countries. I think we also need to accept that fragility has some external reasons, like the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of proxy wars. And the securitization of fragility is not helpful, seeing that as an internal problem. So in a way, Ambassador, do you think the identity of neutrality when it comes to mediation for Canada, is that still intact? Do you think Canada is still a neutral mediator?
Okay, thank you very much. Moritz Pösch, a student of philosophy and culture from Germany. And of course very unfamiliar with international law. Was just one question, because yesterday I got the sense, and I just want to enlarge it, and I might be very wrong, that also, I mean, regional powers, maybe like Turkey, I don't know, might be also interested in strengthening, I mean, very much their own law systems in their area. And of course, if many do this, international law becomes a little bit less interesting. And maybe the respect only between regional law system increases. So just what are the prospects in the future for international law?
Please, Your Excellency.
Maybe one quick more.
Özlem Piltanoğlu, former Turkish parliamentarian. You mentioned in your presentation about the International Criminal Court, and we know that so many countries have already signed or approved the Rome Statute from their parliament. But some countries like United States, Israel, including my country, Turkey, actually haven't signed the Rome Statute. And we know that in 2010, there was a review conference on ICC. So I would like to learn actually your perspective about this issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
The reason why actually they're not signing or actually not ratifying or rejecting to have ICC as a tool for combating war crimes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all the questions, excellent ones. The challenge is that each of those questions could be a conference in and of itself. So I'm conscious of the time that I have, so please forgive me for rather brief, succinct answers. The responsibility to protect, I think it's very much in discussion right now, particularly with respect to Syria. I think that you're quite right that I only focused on national issues, but I didn't mean to exclude others. And I think the colonial context, the manipulation sometimes of major powers, often can be a significant factor. And it can also be non-state actors. I think I'm no expert on the Democratic Republic of Congo, but from what I understand, a very, very rich resource country, yet an incredibly poor country. And there are companies operating there, some including some Canadian companies with very high standards of corporate social responsibility, paying taxes to the government, but others not so nobly. And you see essentially a conflict fueled by the desire for precious metals and precious minerals. The Canadian identity, I think it has changed a little bit. In the late 90s, the early 2000s, we had a foreign minister who was known to promote what we called the human security agenda. This led to the Landmines Convention, the Rome Statute, responsibility to protect, and some other initiatives. I would argue, and I didn't include all the examples, that really would have bored you, but all the things we are doing, I think sometimes because we've put a focus on robust interventions, Afghanistan, we had a major troop presence there with Turkey, with the US, with a number of EU countries, but it was a hot peacekeeping mission in terms of we lost 150 plus soldiers, and as well as our robust intervention in Libya. So the focus seems to be, we're shifting, but we remain very active in a number of different areas. So I don't think it's fair to say that our identity has shifted completely. But there has been more of a focus on results as opposed to, I guess, the criticism that some offered to the human security agenda was that we were a little bit all over the map. International law, we could spend days talking about that, and I would love it. I would probably put most of you to sleep, but I personally, I feel very strongly about that. My government feels very strongly about the importance of international rule of law. But there will always be this philosophical debate about international law. There are a number of scholars, many from the right wing of the United States, who say there is no international law. It's about politics, and it's about power and power structures. And anything that is seen as international law is seen as designed to restrict the sovereignty, the ability to act of all countries, but particularly the major countries. And often they don't like it. So anything that is seen as restricting their ability to work is either rejected or qualified or whatever. They're quite prepared to work internationally, Security Council, but for at least 5 countries, and it could be more in the future, they have a veto. So, what the rules that the Security Council, the obligations the Security Council creates, apply, let's say, to the rest of the world, not necessarily to those who can block or veto. And that leads into the next question, which was the ICC, and that was very much the thinking of certainly some of the P5 countries. Remember, not all the P5 countries, the UK and France are parties to the ICC, and strong supporters, I might add. But at the time, a Republican administration in the United States did not want any infringement on its national security. Actually, when we negotiated Rome, it was President Clinton, and President Bush was elected later. But same kind of philosophy. It was a Republican-dominated Congress at the time. So the U.S. was in favor of the ICC, but argued for what I would call exceptionalism. They put forward different mechanisms where the ICC could not exercise jurisdiction without the Security Council. This would have meant all 5 P5 countries had a veto. They also came up with a different formula to exempt themselves and limited other states. This was not acceptable to the wide body of other countries. I don't know what something I want to work on. I don't know what the current Turkish position is. I know at the time we had lengthy discussions. Turkey was disappointed that terrorism was not included. Obviously, that's a very current issue. And the problem was not that we didn't want to include it, but I remember many discussions with the head of your delegation saying, you can't have a crime in international law. I forget what the Latin proposal is, but you can't have a crime unless it's clearly defined. And there was no way politically to define terrorism because, you know, Canada had a definition, other countries had a definition, but people wanted exceptions for example, national liberation movements fighting against colonial and foreign occupation. So that brings in a political element. You don't have a clear-cut crime. So we said, you solve the definition issue, we'll include the crime. And that politically was not possible and still is a challenge to this day. The review conference, which just met, added the crime of aggression, which was also politically very sensitive in 1998. But they were able to come up with a formula which balanced a clear definition with a primary role for the Security Council, but not an exclusive role. So I believe that was adopted, and I believe it's now going around to countries to ratify, because as an amendment to the statute, it has to be brought in. I would argue, in summation, that the ICC has been politically and legally as important to success as when we adopted it. We now have over 120 countries that have ratified. You hit the nail on the head in terms of who hasn't ratified, and that is a significant portion of the world's population and the biggest countries in the world. So you have Russia, China, US, Turkey, India, China, Vietnam, you know, so major population centers. But I'm optimistic. We're working on it. And if you take the US view, for example, not likely they'll ratify that tomorrow, but you had a perspective where the Bush administration tried to unsign the convention. President Clinton, in his last days in office, had actually signed it, not ratified, signed it. And the Bush administration tried to unsign it. So you go from that perspective in 2001 to today, where the U.S. is quietly, diplomatically cooperating with the court and has allowed two Security Council references to the court. So you had the reference of Sudan, and you have now the reference of Libya. Both non-state parties, normally the court wouldn't have jurisdiction, but the Security Council can give jurisdiction to the court.
Okay, well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I would ask you to please join me in expressing our sincere gratitude to His Excellency Ambassador John Holmes. Thank you.